Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to learn a little bit about the history of the church and the texts of canon, which were the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew and the Apocalypse of Peter, also originally in Hebrew. And we will see that in the Eastern bishops of the church, before even the split with Catholicism back in the 800s, were included the Revelation or the Apocalypse of Peter and the Gospel of Hebrews. And this was in a work that was called the Stichometry of Nicephorus. He was a bishop, and he simply was just recording how many lines there were, because when you write a Bible, you have to know how many lines it takes to fit each one in. And that was important in making a decision of, how many pages you needed to begin with and how you would bound the book and all these issues. So these are the reference lines. So we know what it was. Their canon included these works or the reading material. So let's ask ourselves why and how they became forgotten. If you change the language that people read from Hebrew or even consider, you would get rid of these books automatically. It's just de facto becomes a problem to keep people attentive to them and keep copying them. So this is the title of this episode: The Best Way for Roman Herodian Enemies of Jesus to Bludgeon Jesus with the Apostasy of Paul. There's no dispute Paul's an apostate, by the way. I mean, he definitely does away with the law, right? The question is an apostate allowed to actually do away with the law? He can't. He has no authority because he's actually guilty of apostasy, meaning he's a false prophet by definition. That's in Deuteronomy 13, 1-10. So he cannot be valid. But that's what people believe. They believe Paul can be an apostate and do away with the law of apostasy itself, do away with Deuteronomy 13, because an apostate has more authority than Deuteronomy 13, which condemns apostates to death. That's exactly. All right, enough said about that. So the Herodian enemies of Jesus are going to use the apostasy of Paul to destroy the movement of Christianity. It's a poison pill, but it's in Greek. It's all in Greek, and the church doesn't have any clue. The Hebrew-speaking church doesn't have a clue what's going on, and how are they going to destroy the works that were kept in Hebrew and were still in the church centuries later, that had passages that were inimical to Pauline Christianity? How were they going to get rid of them? Simply keep them in Hebrew. Don't translate them, or just eventually let them be destroyed. So I want to show you also, there's a prophecy of Daniel that there will be a very successful Pauline-like apostate movement that does away with God's laws, right in Daniel 7. We'll see it. But in the end, God promises that movement will be defeated. So everybody tells me, oh, well, Doug, you're on the losing team. The Ebionites lost, and, apostasy has won, and doing away with God's law must be true, because why hasn't God stopped it? Well, you know what? God has already told you he's going to let it go all the way to obliteration, and then he's going to take it back. And you're going to see that's in Daniel 7, and you're going to see who is the enemy of God, who is the Antichrist at the same time. So let me, I'm just going to give you a quick notification what's here on the bottom, the Stichometry of Nicephorus. He was a bishop. He was just simply putting together in the Eastern churches, and there was no separation yet between West and East at the time. This was before the schism between the Eastern and the West. That was in the 1000 era and early 1000 era. And then this is in the 800s. And they are just he's listing out the number of lines you need to copy the book of Revelation of John, and the book of Revelation of Peter, and the book of Gospel of the Hebrews of Matthew. That's what it was also it was called, in short, the Gospel of the Hebrews by Matthew. And here's the number of lines. He wrote it all down. So this was clearly accepted. It was being used in the canon of the church, and they're all gone. There's no even record of, except the Revelation of John, all these works that were key and crucial. And I'm going to show you what is the motivation to get rid of them. And it fulfills prophecy. And so when people tell me, well, you've been defeated, Doug, the Ebionites and the pro-Jesus movement has lost, and the Pauline movement has won, and therefore that proves that the Pauline movement is valid, I'm going to show you it's prophesied exactly that the Pauline movement would win, and that the message of Christ would be defeated for a time, and the saints would be defeated for a time. Daniel tells us all about this, but the ultimate victory comes. So let's take a look at all that. So let's take a little deeper look here. Stichometry of Nicephorus. He was patriarch of Constantinople. That means he's living in modern Turkey. And the catalog of the Old and New Testament books is followed by that of the Antilogomena, which contains the Revelation of John, and of the Apocrypha. Next to each book is the count of the stichoi, or lines, and of the New Testament writings, he includes these three. And you can find this at newtestamentcanon.org. Okay? So there's a person who's not even trying to tell you anything about the contents, just simply is making these mentions of these records. That means these books still existed. So the destruction of Jewish Christianity, if you will, the Hebrew speaker version of Christianity, doesn't happen even till this time. After this time, it will go away. And I just want to mention here is now Patriarch of Constantinople is not the Bishop of Jerusalem that was going on in the Eastern Church. So you got to know there's going to be a split coming up in a couple hundred years, that the church at Constantinople is going to be deemed the West, and then the East will be the church of what we call today the Eastern Orthodox, but they're just going to be called the Jerusalem Church at the time. And they traced the Jerusalem Church always of that split after 1000 was always tracing their bishops all the way back to James, while the Roman Church made a point of saying, oh well, our bishop was Peter from the beginning, but Peter actually never took the post of Bishop of Rome. That's the irony. Some other person named Linus was the first bishop of the church, and I think it would have been a step down in a sense for Peter to claim he was the Bishop of Rome. He was an apostle, so that's why he never took that post. So it's ironic that the Roman Catholic Church admits that Peter never had the office of bishop, but they claim he's their founder of their church. Another irony of history. So he's actually, if you do the math here, he's literally in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, but he's not in the Church of the East that later was split off, and that will be a church only located primarily in Jerusalem and the region of the Middle East. And the church at Constantinople will remain part of the Western Church. So the what you now know as Roman Catholicism would be still at this location. Anyway, so let's continue. Now, why would people get rid of the Revelation of Peter? Okay, so obviously Peter doesn't speak Greek. He didn't barely could speak the language of his community. He was considered ignorant by the Sanhedrin. I pointed that out in Acts 4. So what was the reason they wanted to get rid of it? Well, it had some very interesting passages, and I'm going to read a couple of them to you now. The Apocalypse of Peter in the Wikipedia. And they will cleave to the name of a dead man. This is Jesus speaking, thinking that they will become pure. But they will become greatly defiled, and they will fall into the name of error and into the hand of an evil, cunning man and a manifold dogma, and they will be ruled without law. By the way, people tell me, oh, Paul was martyred. How could Jesus talk like this about Paul? He wasn't martyred. That's in the first letter to the Corinthians by Bishop of Rome Clement in pre-70 AD. He's talking about the Jerusalem temple still there and the sacrifices are still going on. So he's writing this before 70 AD. Paul died approximately in 67 AD, but he didn't die at Rome, where you're told 2 or 3 centuries later he died a martyr in Rome. But the Bishop of Rome is Clement, and he says, no, Paul died on the extremity of the kingdom, which the extreme west of the kingdom, and that would have been Spain. And Paul had many times said he wanted to go to Spain. Also, the people of Spain have this tradition that that's where Paul died. So you got tradition, and you have actually Bishop Clement saying that, and that's in First Clement chapter 5, verse 5. And he actually uses the words, Paul at long last departed out of this world and received his rewards, whatever. He wasn't an anti-Paul person. He wasn't trying to say this to condemn him, but he's an objective source that Paul did not die at Rome as a martyr, because the Bishop of Rome, Clement, would have known that. And second of all, we have his actual affirming how he died and where and when he died. And it was a peaceful death, and he departed at long last out of this world. Okay, so put that to one side. Now read it again. And they will cleave to the name of a dead man. Paul is dead in 67, thinking they will become pure, but they will become greatly defiled. So you Christians who are following a dead man who is guilty of being evil and cunning and a manifold dogma, and he try to rule you without law, that guy is leading you to be defiled. That's not good. That would lead me to conclude Jesus saying you're not going to make it to heaven. So do you want to keep going that way? That's up to you. But that's why this book had to be removed. But it had more than that. Here's Jesus talking, the Apocalypse of Peter. You can find the work online to read it easily. 1924, M.R. James translation, Oxford Clarendon Press. So top scholar translating it, and listen to what he quotes in Jesus saying. And what's going to be offensive to the Pauline Christian is the end. Just these words at the very end, I underlined and read. But it's very interesting to listen to slight differences from your standard Matthew, but it is still very similar. And our Lord answered us, saying, so they're at the temple, and they're asking Jesus, what's the sign of all these things happening? And he says this: take heed that no man deceive you, that ye be not doubters, and serve other gods. Many shall come in my name, they're going to say they're Jesus, saying, I am the Christ. Believe them not, neither draw near unto them, for the coming of the Son of Man shall not be plain, that is ordinary, but as the lightning that shines from the east unto the west. So I will come upon the clouds of heaven with a great host in my majesty. Now, right there, that automatically is also problematical for Pauline Christians, because Paul claims Jesus had a private meeting with him and a couple other guys. They could hear the voice, could see the light. They didn't understand the voice because they don't know Hebrew, apparently. And he's probably with some Gentile guys trying to kill Christians at that moment, right? So but it's not his head, it's not a vision. It's actually, he's claiming Jesus returned to earth to see him after the ascension 2 or 3 years later. And Jesus says, that's not the way it's going to happen. It's when I come back, it's going to be the light shining from east to west. I will come upon clouds of heaven with a great host of my majesty. So anybody who claims they met me in a private room or in a wilderness road, don't believe that it met me, because my return is a universal return. That's how Matthew reads it 24. But Apocalypse of Peter has a similar account and a similar prohibition on Paul's claims to validity. Let's continue. It even gets better than Matthew. I will come in my majesty, shining sevenfold more than the sun. Will I come in my majesty with all my saints? So think about that. He's saying the light is so bright, it's sevenfold of the light of the sun. So take the sun and multiply by 7. I think that's very important, because it's not as clear in the account in Matthew that it's sevenfold light. That means there's no way that Paul could claim he's the only one who sees him, and there's no historical event about this light that he sees from heaven shining down on him. There's no mention of that at all in history. This is intended by Jesus to signify a very bright light that the whole world will see, and is from every point east and every point west. And then he says, with all my saints, and that's going to tie into the book of Daniel, which I'm going to quote in a little while. And he will come with mine angels, my holy angels. And my Father shall set a crown upon my head. So now he's going to be made king. This is what he's promised in Daniel 7, verses 13 to 14, as the Son of Man going up into heaven to speak with God, that I may judge the quick and the dead. Now, who's our judge? Jesus. So we better be lining up with what he teaches us, and not a guy named Paul who claims I can't even repeat anything I'm told in the third heaven that I'm getting from Jesus. But trust me, when I'm communicating to you, even though I can't quote him and it's illegal and illicit for me to quote Jesus, I'm somehow oozing his thoughts. Okay, that's not how it works, Paul. But that's what he says in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 4 to 6. Just read that. It's illegal and illicit and unspeakable what I'm hearing in the third heaven from Jesus. And I can't tell you anything he said. But he's implying we just have to trust him, that his words are from God, right? That's not how it works, Paul. You have to quote the person you're claiming is your authority. Anyway, you set a crown upon my head that I may judge the quick and the dead, and get this, recompense every man according to his works, exactly as it reads in the book of Revelation. That's what Jesus says there. And people often say, oh my gosh, that can't be from Jesus, because that would be violative of Paul's statements. Well, you can see, here's another book they're going to throw out, because Paul talks about you're saved by faith, not works, and blah, 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 unless any man should boast. And James is the opposite. James says justification is by works and not by faith alone. That's James chapter 2, verse 24. And that's in the Bible too. You claim everything in that word is inspired, but you don't pay attention how clear and unequivocal James is. And you look at the more ambiguous statements by Paul and you put more weight on them than you do James. Just my observation. But wait, it's going to get better. Now, fortunately for us, that the Jewish people were keeping a copy of our Hebrew Gospel Matthew, and they were forced to do this by the kings of Aragon in Spain, because they were forced into debates to defend or fight against Christianity, but they were told they can't win. You have to always lose. And if you try to win too hard, we may banish you. And they did that to a couple of the Jewish scholars, and they sent them to Jerusalem. Okay. But anyway, it was a contest, and it went on for many decades. And they literally went back and they said, you know what? We have been keeping in our reservoir of stuff here the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And one of the reasons you can tell it's pre 160 AD is very interesting. Pre 167, I should say, because in that year, the Emperor of Rome put out a law that you can no longer say the word Yahweh, no longer say, or Jehovah, whichever it may be. You couldn't say it anymore, and you couldn't write it. You couldn't record it. Nothing. And that's what really caused in hindsight, I realized the scribes of Judaism were compelled to take the word of God out due to Roman law, or otherwise they couldn't spread their word. So they would use the reference to Hashem. Christians might use the word Kyrios, Lord, or both might use the word Adonai, which would be also Lord. So there was a lot of necessity to get rid of the word Yahweh out of the text. And that would also explain why there's no Christian texts that date prior to 167 that are in Greek that have any language that would say anything at all. We don't have them. They're gone. So that forced a lot of textual destruction, I believe, that decree. The interesting thing, though, is that here we have the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, and guess what? The Tetragrammaton is over and over in here. And so this means this text goes back prior to 167. And now, at the same time, Professor Howard, who put this book together, George Howard, Professor of Religion, University of Georgia, 1995, he explains there's some examples where you can tell that the Latin Vulgate was having to be considered an addendum to the text, and they would then put that in as well, so they could be participating in the debate fully informed of what the Christians were claiming. So there's some emendations that were caused to fit in with the version that Jerome had made in Latin of the Bible. Okay, with that said, now let's listen to what this text, I believe, goes all the way back to uh, the Apostle Matthew. And this is Matthew 24. So we're just reading Matthew 24 before. And I think this is the real problem, not only in the Apocalypse of Peter for Paul Christians, but also for Paul Christians trying to read the original Matthew 24. And that's why this book has to go out of print. In other words, you're not going to keep it in Christian circles. It ends up staying only in the Hebrew Jewish circles out of necessity to fight the King of Aragon and the King of Spain's the debaters they were up against. And it says, Jesus says this in verse 11, and many false or wicked prophets. Now, by the way, this is the reconstruction by Stanford Rives in this book. Let me just show you here. It's called The Original Gospel of Matthew, Volume 1, Variants. The variants from the earliest Matthew by Stanford Rives. Okay? Now let's go back here. For many, well, we'll just stay right on this slide. And many false wicked prophets shall rise and shall seduce many, or lead many astray. And when apostasy, it's a key term. I want to explain what is the word apostasy. The Jewish Encyclopedia explains what it is. It's based on Deuteronomy 13:1-10. Jewish Encyclopedia says is applied in a religious sense to signify rebellion and rebels against God and the law, desertion and deserters of the faith of Israel. Apostasy and apostates from Judaism. Jewish Encyclopedia, Isidore Singer, editor, Funk and Wagnalls, 1912-13. And now, do you have any doubt that Paul turned against and rebelled against God's law? If you have any doubt, go read Galatians 3:19. The law was given by angels through a mediator. That's 3:19. He progresses and later says, who are no gods. Later in Galatians 4, verses 6 and 9, he calls them elements and elemental spirits. And Vincent says it's translated too shortly. It cuts off too early by saying it's just elements. These were these spirits that control the elements. That was what the meaning of the words was. So it was, again, the angels. The angels were considered in the apocryphal lore, the intertestamental book of Jubilees, a non-canonical book, but it was still influencing Paul's mind. That was stated that you would have angels that control the wind, water, and fire, the elements. And so Paul is denigrating them as, and then he says they're weak and beggarly elemental spiritual beings, meaning the angels. So Paul says the law wasn't even given by God; it was given by angels, That's Galatians 3:19, who are weak and beggarly angels who are no gods. When you put all these three passages together, you have a clear definition of somebody who is a rebel against God, and the law, the Torah, wasn't even given by God Yahweh. So if you don't know those passages, there's a reason, because you're only shown Romans at the very beginning of the books. They're not put in the chronological order they were written. Galatians comes either first or second. First Corinthians and Galatians compete for first position in the year 57. The only works Paul wrote before then are Thessalonians, first and second, and they have no apostasy and no doctrines that are antithetical to Christ. They're basically very normative, and people who commit sin are going to be punished and go to hell and all that. Paul had a totally different doctrine in 51 AD, and he changes by 57 AD, and he comes out with this book, Galatians, where it's exactly a rebel against God and the law and deserting of the faith of Israel. And that's why Paul can say there's no more Jew or Gentile, because he's creating a whole new religion that has nothing to do with that what had occurred in the past. And we're going to live by the Spirit and no longer by the letter of the law. That's in Corinthians. So he is totally pointing to a new path. And if you're on it, you're on a path of apostasy. And yet you'll be told by dispensational Christians, yes, we can go on a path of apostasy because Paul has the right and the power from Jesus to get rid of the law. Isn't he the Lord? But you see, Jesus himself says, I can't do that. The law will not go away, not one jot or tittle will go away until the heavens and earth pass away. And so the law itself says it's eternal. 27 times says it's eternal, or excuse me, everlasting for all generations. So until those generations cease, so law actually carefully added that word for all generations every time, in signifying it's a law, ongoing, as long as there are generations on earth. And that's what Jesus said too. As long as there's heaven and earth there, it'll be in effect. So you can't, Jesus had no power to get rid of that. He was a son of God. He was an agent of God. He can't violate God's word. He would be an apostate and he'd be justly killed. And he didn't do that. He reaffirmed that it was continuous until the heavens and earth pass away. But anyway, that's the word apostasy here. Now that's important because these are the kind of references we need to know. What was so scary to the Pauline Christians about this Hebrew gospel that had to be destroyed? This is one fact I found reading the Hebrew gospel of Matthew that was kept by the Jewish people, unwittingly helping us, Pauline, and people who are realizing that Paul is a false apostle. We can now help Christians back to Christ by showing them how the gospel of Matthew originally looked, as best as we can expect. When apostasy shall abound or be multiplied, and the love of many shall grow faint or wax cold, but he that remains standing firm waits until, or has patience at the end, the same shall be saved. So let me go over that again. When apostasy shall abound, the charity, love of many shall grow faint or wax cold, but he that remains standing firm waits until, or has patience at the end, that same shall be saved, okay, or have life. And this gospel, that is the evangeli, shall be preached in the whole world for a testimony to all the Gentiles. So there's another example where Jesus is making sure there's no second dispensation that, it's only for Jews. He's saying my gospel is for everyone. Because, by the way, he's, as Peter says in Acts 3, verse 23, 24, Jesus is the prophet of Deuteronomy. That prophet, a prophet of Deuteronomy 18, he is a person whose every word will be coming from God. God's going to says he's going to put his words in him, and his words that he speaks will be from me, and I will hold accountable all people to have obeyed him. That means people, everybody who can learn and know about him are going to be held accountable to have listened to him. And if you are claim to be a Christian and you think you can disregard him under a dispensational theory, you're going to be sadly mistaken, my friends. Let's continue on here. Now, let's finish. I got to go back here again. To all Gentiles, and this gospel, that is the evangeli, shall be preached to the whole world for a testimony to all the Gentiles or nations concerning me, and then shall the end come. So only after all the Gentiles have heard it, then the end will come. But listen to what he says here. Verse 15. So this is Antichrist, and this is the abomination that desolates, which was spoken by Daniel as standing in the holy place. Let the one who reads understand. Now, what's interesting about this is prior to the fall of Jerusalem. So he's going to tell you that the Antichrist has come before the fall of the temple. before 70 AD. The Antichrist is already here. Who could that be? Now let's listen to Daniel 7, 24, 27. Now, I've already told you, if you look at Daniel 7, 13 to 14, you'll see that the Son of Man rises, ascends into heaven, and he asks God basically for an audience, and God says, you will be given the kingdoms and the power of all the earth at some point in time. But now Daniel 7, 24, 27 is talking about an intermediate time, and that's what he's talking about. There are the 10 horns or 10 kings. Now, I'm going to throw out a possibility here, just thinking out loud here. What if there's 10 apostles that exclude John and Peter? Just think about it for a minute. Who shall rise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. Now, what if this another rise? What if kings means rulers or people who seek command, and another shall rise after them? So rises after these 10. And he, this newcomer, and I'm contending he's Paul, he shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. Now, who are the 3 kings? Well, that would be James, Peter, and John. See, so remember, he had these 3 kings, the 3 rulers, the apostles, James, Peter, and James, the bishop of Jerusalem, and John and Peter, 2 apostles. So when you put James, Peter, and John together, you've got 12 apostles and 1 bishop. And maybe you didn't know this, but Epiphanius, in his Panarion, he explains that the reason that James had this authority as the brother of Jesus was, in light of Jesus having died and ascended into heaven, the next person who reigns in place of him as the king of Israel, if the Romans could be thrown out, would be James. So James was basically the king of Israel at that time, as far as the people of Israel were concerned. And that's why he was beloved by everybody, incidentally. And that's why the people of Israel, what led to James' final death was they asked him, begged him, please, we don't trust the high priest. He's an Herodian stooge. We want you because we believe you're a genuine person. We may not all be Christians, but we want you to do the Yom Kippur service that year. And he agreed to do so at approximately in 62 AD, according to Josephus' records. And he goes and does the Yom Kippur service. But Annas, the high priest, was very jealous, the Herodian high priest, I should point out, and he has him killed and slaughtered in an evil way. And the people of Israel were so grieved, even those who were not Christian, that this happened. And then when the temple fell in 70 AD, many people said that was, in their minds, was the punishment for what Annas had done. But there were a lot of other reasons why God had his temple destroyed, but that's another story. Anyway, so you've got Paul in Galatians chapter 2 condemning the 3 pillars. They're so-called pillars. Whatever they were means nothing to me. And he speaks of them in past tense. Whatever they have been in the past means nothing to me. I get all my revelations of third heaven, and I'm basically, he says, without any boasting. Just a matter of fact, I'm superior to them. I'm not inferior to them in one iota, not one bit less than them. Even though he never met Jesus, didn't know Jesus, and even when Jesus appeared on the road to Damascus, he said, "Who are you, sir?" He did not know who it was, so he never met him before, never had any interesting who he is, and how in the world did he really know it was Jesus? How could he know for fact? He said, "I'm Jesus." That's his proof. Anyway, so you've got total of 13 people. 10 kings, 3 other kings, 3 rulers. These are all rulers. Each one is a ruler. And if you read in the book of Revelation, they're all, the 12 apostles are rulers. But at this time, there's 13 because James is the standing in for Jesus on earth till the time of the end. Now let's listen. This one who subdues the 3 kings, and I'm saying it's James, Peter, and John, he shall speak, look at this, New King James Bible, pompous words, prideful, boastful words against the Most High. And what more boastful words can you use than Galatians 3:19, 4:6, and 4:9, that God's, the law was given by angels through a mediator, and goes on to say that who are no gods, and then goes on to say they're weak and beggarly celestial elemental beings who are in control, angels in other words, who are in control of the elements of wind, water, and fire, and so on. So he is pompous, and he's speaking against the Most High by denigrating him, and his work of the Torah is not even done by him, but done by weak and beggarly angels. And that's why the book of Galatians is put in position 3, so you don't see it. You see Romans first, and you get beloved. You fall in love with Paul because it's so easy, so loving, and you can just eat whatever you want and eat the meat sacrificed. All these things, don't worry about it. Easy peasy gospel, and that's what you're magnetized right away. If you read the Galatians first and you studied it carefully, you go, this is disgusting. This is apostasy. I can't follow this guy. And that's why it's put in third position nowadays. Anyway, because it used to not be in third position, I have to tell you, it was put way at the end of the Bible, and now it's been put way up at the front and after Acts. Let's continue. Now listen to this. He, this bad guy, shall persecute the saints of the Most High. Did that happen? Yes, Paul admits it. Murderer, blasphemer. And he shall intend to change the times and the law. Woof! What more of a clear pointer is that? Then the saints shall be given into his hand. And then the saints shall be given into his hand. The saints shall be given into the hands of an apostate. For how many centuries? For a time and a times and a half a time. There it is. A prophecy you can't miss. And what did Jesus talk about as an Antichrist? Here's the Antichrist. An abomination in which desolation, which was spoken of by Daniel, is standing in the holy place. And that's what this gentleman is. Paul does that in two ways. One is he stands in the place of Christ, but he also stands in the place of the Holy Temple at Jerusalem. And if you read the book of Acts more carefully than you have in the past, read Acts 21 through 22, you'll see that Paul's friend Trophimus had violated the middle wall of separation, and the Jews accused Paul of bringing him into the holy place. Paul denied that, but you have to believe him, right? What if he's lying? What they say, you have all these eyewitnesses who claim he brought him in an uncircumcised state, obviously, and defile the temple. And that's how the temple was desecrated by Trophimus, a friend of Paul's from Ephesus. And Luke, by the way, gives you this complete account, and he never claims he knows which is true. He just simply says Paul's account was he was in a ceremonial bath when it happened, when Trophimus did this and the uproar happened. But that may not have been true. What if it really was exactly as the Jews of Asia claimed? He had brought him into the temple, into the holy place, and he defiled it, meaning Trophimus. And then Paul maybe realized he was in trouble, and he ran back to where he was doing the ritual vow that he was told to do by James. And he then pretends that's where he was all along. And that was his defense. That's what he said immediately at the time. But people lie, unfortunately, and that this person is pompous, and he definitely fits all the characteristics of the prophecy of the right here, like point blank, just looks like you're reading a story about Paul's life in the book of Daniel, written 600 BC, 600 years before Christ. And I just want to leave you with this final thing. A church is apostate against Jesus when it no longer remains in the teachings of Jesus. And that's where we are today. We have a book of two forces. We got Paul and we got Jesus. And Paul is one. Really, he has. If you go to church, I kept track for 5 years, and I quoted it. I wrote down every quote of Jesus. I wrote every quote of Paul down. I mean, I just did a tally mark when each one got a full quote. Jesus would get one quote for every 13 of Paul. And whatever church I went to, that's how it worked. One time I went to 3 different activities where teachings were given on a weekend at a church about 7 years ago. And not once was Jesus even quoted, but Paul was quoted 17 times on all these meetings. So like it was a 17-0 wipeout. Anyway, but listen to what Apostle John says. You are apostate against Jesus. Remember, he's the prophet of Deuteronomy, and you must listen to him. And if you don't listen to him, you will be held accountable. And if you don't understand those words, what I just said, and where you can find them in the New Testament, read Acts 3, verse 23 to 24. Apostle Peter leads 5,000 people to Christ with the message that Jesus is the prophet, and you must obey everything he said, or otherwise you'll be cut off from God's people. Not cut off from Judaism, not cut off from the land of Israel, cut off from God's people, the whole people he has throughout the whole world. So it's a message. He's a universal prophet. Now let's listen to what Apostle John says about if you have a freedom to just dabble with Jesus but not follow him. Apostle John explains that if we go beyond Jesus' teachings, we do not have God when so speaking. John writes in 2 John 1, verses 8 to 11, Webster's Bible. Watch yourselves that we, meaning the 12, don't lose the things which we have accomplished, but that we receive a full reward. Whoever transgresses, or literally in Greek, goes beyond, and doesn't remain in the teachings of Christ, doesn't have God. He who remains in the teaching of Christ, the same as both the Father and the Son. So, as I've said before, Paul admits that nothing he's hearing from Jesus in the third heaven can he repeat. It's unspeakable and it's illicit, illegal. This is the actual meaning of the word, illegal for me to repeat anything he says. Go look at 2 Corinthians 12, verses 4-6. You'll find it there. So you're not hearing anything from Jesus by listening to Paul. He admits that, right? So what have you done? You've ended up listening just to Paul, and you've done away with the words of Jesus. You say he's a different dispensation, and he has all these works righteousness and salvation by, things more than faith alone. And that's true. He definitely does. The parable of the sower in the book of Luke is very clear. The believing seed dies and is burns up and destroyed. Burned up in hell, you could almost say, is the consequence. He says he's burned up. He doesn't bear fruit. He falls into temptation, and he's burned. That's the end of him. And then the person after that, he's more puts more effort into it, but eventually, by the cares and worries of this life, makes him choked, and he bears no fruit. So now you have somebody who has a belief but no fruit. The first one had a belief and sinned, fell into temptation, and gets burned up. And then you've got the second seed is goes further, able to begin, but then the cares and worries of this life lead him to produce no fruit, and he's lost. Then the fourth seed is a good and noble soul, which Paul says doesn't even exist. A good and noble soul who then in a good heart bears fruit, not just multiple times, but multiple times over. And that's the saved seed. So it's clear that Jesus of the Gospel of Luke even is so contrary to Paul that only the seed that had fruit is saved. The belief alone of seed 2 and 3 didn't work. Each one had a different problem. One was tempted into sin and the other was unfruitful. See? So yes, they're totally two different messages. You're listening to someone who never quotes Paul, never quotes Jesus, and that's Paul. And you just need to throw that away and realize the victory will be Christ. Because, well, let me just remind you of this. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and half a times. But I need to tell you, this is a good end of this story. So now let's recap, beginning back where we left off about the saints. The saints shall be given into his hand, the evil apostate person who tries to do away with the law for a time and times and half a time. But the heavenly court, shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom, that is the kingdom of the Most High God, is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. And then we saw, remember, Daniel 7:13-14, in a prior episode, I explained the Son of Man ascends into heaven, and God then gives the Son the dominion and power that he has over to the Son to rule and reign over the people. So that's how it works. All right. God bless. Take care. I hope this helps you. Ciao. Bye.